Grading, yeah. I mean, it's been a good week for wait for this because not only did the men not score, but the women didn't score either. So that's. Do we get any points for
But,
that?
but your new stadium will score on the grading criteria.
Yeah, but we live next door to Castleford and Featherstone and Leeds and all these other teams, so we won't get points for that. I haven't looked into it in lots of detail, only for the fact that I can't change anything, but I've got them in front of me. You get this is 25% for fandom. I'm going to read this out for people who haven't seen it. Encouraging clubs to attract more fans in stadiums, both at home and digitally. How do you be digitally in a stadium? And improve fan engagement, contributing to both club and central revenues, which I think means get more people following you on TikTok and sell more shirts. Performance, 25%. Incentivizing clubs to perform on the field and drive fan awareness and engagement. Teams will be ranked between 1 and 36 based on where they finish in the leagues for the previous 3 seasons. Bonus points to be awarded for teams who win league and cup competitions in the previous season. So that's good for if you win the 1895 Cup. Finances, 25%. And people will see again this phrase coming up, reflecting the success of fan engagement and business performance, and rewarding sustainable investment as well as diversified revenue streams and sound financial management. So there you go, there's a tick for Wakefield. 50% for stadium, based on a number of factors, including facilities and utilisation, which add value to the fan and broadcast or digital viewer experience, and match or exceed competition from other sports and events. And 10% for catchment, based on the area population and number of clubs in the area, with a view to maximising growth of the sport in the largest markets to generate new fan bases and incentivise investment. I mean, immediately, gentlemen, I'm holding up that piece of paper that Keithley brought to the meeting saying retain promotion and relegation. It's very important and everything, but that all seems like a fair framework for growing the sport. Now, whether that's the right way of going is up to people to decide, and people either like promotion and relegation or like this or like a mixture of things, but they all seem to be things which we should strive to be, don't they?
I think the talking to Carl Hall, who obviously is in charge of a club in League One, which has a degree of uncertainty about how that's going to go in the future. The one thing he said is that it puts the onus of responsibility back on the club. You're now being given a framework by which your club is judged. You're being given the tools necessary to make your club the best it can be. And that area of responsibility goes out of the governing body and just handing out money to what do you bring to the sport. I think that is a responsible way of looking at something like this. I think the other thing is, I don't know why it's taking so long. We were told, 3/4 of the way through last year that this was coming in. We were told that criteria would be announced before the end of last season, so clubs would be able to have a look at it. We've now been told what the criteria are. I would think the 3 of us could sit down and rank virtually every club from 1 to 36. It doesn't need a lot of investigative journalism to say a club would sit in a spot. We're being told quite rightly that there won't be enough A clubs to fill Super League, which is the ultimate aim. So you're going to have some B clubs in there. You've now got a sliding scale of rating those B clubs. To me, I don't have a problem with any of this, just the speed of which it's being implemented and the fact that it has to go back to the clubs for them to say so, when really I thought we'd employed IMG to bring this kind of thing in themselves.
Yeah, I don't know how the governance is played out. I mean, I think IMG would say it's a 12-year project. They're not in it for the short term, and I think for me it's about getting it right. And if it takes a few weeks, a few months longer, then ultimately that's what it is. I think my understanding is they're going to issue at the end of this season sort of gradings based on 2023, which will then give the opportunity for the club to have an understanding where they would fit into that structure. And then the determined grade is made in 2024 at some stage. Is that right?
Yeah. So the 2025 season is
when it starts.
If it gets passed by the clubs on the 19th of April.
Yeah, and that's the bit that I'm not sure on. Like you, why bring somebody in unless you otherwise implement what their recommendations are? But I think that's just the way that the RFL is governed, that each club has a vote, etc. But I will be highly surprised if it's not voted through. I think there was one abstention and one opposition last time.
I think there were Keithley objecting, a couple of abstentions. Yeah. That was all.
So I think there's overwhelming support there, and I think now they put a little bit more sort of flesh on the bones. None of that should really come as any surprise to people. I think that's probably what people were anticipating. I mean, with a surveyor's hat on, it looks very much like how you would, if you took a property to market and invited bids. It's how you'd set out in advance of that process, how you would analyse the offers that were going to come in, how you'd score them, etc. So then you allow the people the opportunity to bid. So it's very much the same model. The question remains: is that appropriate for sport?
It is for a sport that doesn't have enough finance and is partly full-time and partly part-time. I think, again, you look at the history of promotion and relegation within the sport of rugby league, going right back to 1895, it just promotes a boom and bust mentality, which means the sport itself can never go forward. And if we take Keithley as an example, the only way currently, I know they object to this way of doing it, but the only way currently they could get into Super League would be to probably put together a team that they can't afford to sustain. So they would need to buy players to the absolute maximum of the salary cap to get them over the line on the pitch. That's not a sustainable model with everything else that's behind them in terms of their ground capacity, their junior development, all the things that this is asking for. So I don't have an issue that, I think there's two things. One is, just because you have a grading system, it doesn't mean that promotion and relegation is gone. You can move up and down the ladder depending on how you run your business.
Absolutely. And
so you're not saying it's either or.
Yeah.
But the other thing is we've got to stop dragging the game back to its lowest common denominator. So if clubs are overspending to get to the point where they're in a false position, that doesn't help them or the sport. And that's what I think this...
And there's no guarantee by spending all that money that they actually would win that, because it ultimately comes down to a championship grand final, doesn't it? A £1 million game, we'll call it what you wish. And 80 minutes, anything can happen. So there's no guarantee. You can spend all that money and then suddenly you then bust because you haven't got to Super League. For me, I think it's a transparent system. People can see what targets they need to meet. And it will take clubs time to meet those targets. Clubs who are graded a C, for example, aren't going to turn it around in 12 months.
No.
But at least they can see that. And if you're an investor wanting to come in and invest in a club that's on a grade C, at least you can then see, well, these are the areas that I need to improve on. This is my current score. This is the score I need to get to a grade B license or a grade A license. And then you can target your spend accordingly. And it's not just on players' wages.
And we are short of investors and new investors. And that, again, is a blueprint that says, if you're in an expansion area or you're taking over an existing club, you know exactly where your investment is going. The whole Toronto thing, when we look at it and re-examine it, the amount of money that was spent on that club was phenomenal. How it was spent and whether it was spent wisely at the end and whether debts were honoured or whatever, that's a different issue to the fact that a huge amount of money was put in by an owner. 10,000 new fans were brought to the sport in the new market. But because of the way of things like promotion, relegation and other restrictions put on that club that they had to meet all the costs of the teams that were coming to play there, that investment has ultimately been completely and utterly wasted. And we're not a sport that can afford to do that. This way, I think if you wanted to take over a club that was going to score immediately on its catchment area, so you wanted to invest, let's say, in a Newcastle who might score 2 straight away on that, you need to know what you have to do in the other areas of the club to make it sustainable. As an investor coming new into the sport, I'd say that's a responsible way of looking at it. I don't have to buy my way through the divisions. I don't have to waste money in areas that I know is not going to have a return for 3 or 4 years. I can target a business plan to the objectives that are put out on that. I actually think this is a really responsible way of going about future-proofing, which is a horrible word, clubs and the sport. And we should actually be welcoming this.
Well, most clubs have. And the thing that surprises me about Keithley necessarily is not their objection to whatever they think is going to happen, but they seem to be a progressive club. They seem to be a club that are trying to do things in the community to attract different audiences, which is the kind of thing that would get you points on this system. They are trying to engage new audiences, which, as we know, have been lacking in rugby league for well, since 1895, I guess. So they are trying to do things. They are, I guess, improving fan engagement and driving fan awareness and engagement. And they've got that promotion. They've got the off-field stuff there. So they have a chance of becoming, in the future, a club in Super League from what they're doing off the field as well as on it. And you're right, for a Keighley, to use other examples, let's say Oldham, Swinton, Rochdale, basically any team in League One, unless you've got someone who's going to come in and throw millions and millions of pounds at a squad, the dream doesn't exist. The dream is not real. It's the same in football. Blackburn Rovers won the Premier League in the mid-90s because their owner had a load of money and bought some good players. But they're now where they are, and the new money has come in and become Man City have gone from the third division to a giant in the Premier League. But 20 years ago, when they didn't have that money, they weren't there. So sustainability is a good idea.
If you're coming in as an investor as well, one of the things that's going to count against you is if your investment is the sole reason why you're scoring points on finance. So what you've actually got to do is not just invest in a club that is going to do well on the field. You've got to invest in areas like how do you deal with your fans? What is your stadium like? Now, all those other issues mean that it's not just about you bringing money. It's about how the club spends that money responsibly. So I would prefer if we were in an area of governance whereby once we'd agreed the 12-year deal with IMG, once we'd set up a board of RL commercial, that superseded the Rugby League Council for decision making. So if IMG have proposed and the Rugby League Council board agree that this is what we're doing, we implement it. Because I would have liked to have seen that we went through this whole process with unanimity, because it shows that the game is moving in the right direction. The problem again for me with Keithley's objection and how vociferous it's been and handing out an alternative paper when the criteria are released is that will always be picked up as a news story. It has to be. But the problem then is that you instead of looking at the whys and wherefores of what we're doing and why it might be responsible and moving the game forward, we've always got division. I'm not sure we need division at this time when we're going to market to negotiate with the television broadcaster.
And we're looking forward to the wider rebrand of the men's and women's Super League competitions later this year ahead of the 2024 season launch by IMG sister company and cultural marketing agency. I don't know what that means. 160/90 cultural marketing. I didn't do that in A-level business studies in the late 90s. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's all very interesting. It's all.
One of the challenges, though, licensing system that we had before, talking on the field here, was that you ended up with too many games towards the end of the season that were meaningless. So I'm not sure what does this system do to counteract that? Because your on-field performance only counts for a small, what is it, 25% of your overall score.
The corollary of that it gives you a chance to build clubs so that as and when we get more A-grade clubs, they are it doesn't do the NRL any harm that clubs from year to year can change their position on the league table because there isn't relegation behind them. I would cite Catalan as the perfect example of that they were absolved from relegation for the first 3 years. They would have gone down initially before they even had a chance to build a club, to taste the atmosphere of Super League. But look at them now, 15, 16, 17 years on, they've won a Challenge Cup, they've been in a grand final, they hold the record for the highest attendance of a Super League game. That they were able to build their business initially that now makes it sustainable further down the line. And looking at their performance on Thursday night, and particularly all 4 games they've played this year, when they of all clubs had more players playing in the World Cup than anybody else, I think what they've got now with more young French players coming through is something that is going to stand them in good stead, that every time we sit and do our predictions at the beginning of the season, we've got them more at the top end than the bottom end. I think it was almost criminal what happened to Toulouse last year, that they were almost in that same boat, that we've got a city in France that is a rugby city that's one of the 4th biggest in France. It's got some huge industries there. They've got a ground which you'll have refereed at that is a great facility. But we'll never know how good they would have been, because of promotion relegation meant that business almost went to the wall because they were relegated. But they were always going to be relegated in their first year. That's when they were going to be vulnerable. And they wanted to play those players that have got them out of the Championship to at least give them the opportunity. I think that's what we've got to stop. And that on the field, there will always be meaningless games. There'll always, there's been a 60-0 already this year. You can't control that. The salary cap is evenly spread in the NFL, but there are still some blowout scores in matches.
I don't think it should be about eliminating blowout scores, because you'll have that. I think what you want is uncertainty of result.
Absolutely.
And I think you saw that the weekend, didn't you? Because how many people would have predicted that Lee would have beat St Helens?
Exactly.
And I think the more games you get where you've got uncertainty of outcome, the more people will be engaged with the sport, and hopefully that will be a byproduct of the grading system.
And I think you get in there if you do that, because as I said, there's always a league. The NFL is a classic example. Everybody spends maximum salary cap. They have a draft to make sure that the college players go to the least ranked team. You would think that would be a competition whereby you wouldn't be able to predict any result any week. But what is it? Of the 18 rounds, after 12, there's already teams that can't qualify for the playoffs. So that's where it does come down to how you manage your roster, how good your coach is. I think we'll get to that with a system like this, but with promotion relegation, there's too much looking over your shoulder, unsustainable business models. Stick with this, have a slight expansion element with your catchment area, so that there is an encouragement to say to areas like Cornwall or France. I mean, I think this is geared up to the French team as much as anyone, London particularly. There's an extra incentive for you that other clubs who are traditionally based won't have. And actually, the new clubs that come in will be sustainable and competitive sooner rather than later. And I think if that's what we get, then your right concern about games that don't matter will actually be less relevant.
I mean, if it gives clubs a kick up the backside to try and find new supporters. I mean, Wakefield, an example there. Michael Carter for years has banged on about wanting, was it 6,500 to spend the full salary cap? Salford have been to 2 cup finals in recent years, and their crowds are, I don't know if they're stagnant or not, but they're not growing by thousands, are they?
No.
Lee.
Also, I thought it was a really telling comment by Troy Grant, who obviously the head of the IRL, who when he saw some of the social media debate about whether grading was a good or a bad thing, actually said, the Heartlands were not as supportive as the World Cup as perhaps he would have hoped. Now, again, there's a bigger debate about ticketing prices and where the matches were staged and all that. But it's interesting that somebody who doesn't come from our competition and viewed it from the outside said yes, there is an element of you have to support what we've already got, but let's not lose sight of the fact that purely those areas are not going to sustain the game on their own, which is just, I thought was a very interesting comment.
It is, but I think international sport allows a greater cut through, doesn't it? If you live in London, you never watched Rugby League before, but you've got an interest in following an England team, you're more likely to go and watch it. If it's a London Broncos team, for example, or another London team, then you may be slightly less inclined. I appreciate it's still London, but I think that's the beauty of international sport, and that's unfortunate why the game as a whole can't all buy into it.
Which is great that we're taking the next England internationals to that great non-Heartlands place of Warrington. But there you go.